Have you ever walked away from an argument feeling exhausted rather than enlightened? Perhaps you won the debate, but somehow still feel hollow inside. Or maybe you've noticed how some people seem desperate to prove their point in every conversation, while others, often those you respect most, speak less but carry more weight when they do. Today, we're exploring a provocative idea from one of history's most misunderstood philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche's belief that constant arguing isn't a sign of intellectual strength, but often masks a profound inner weakness. By the end of our journey together, you'll see disagreements in a new light and might even transform how you engage in difficult conversations. The final insight might completely change your approach to intellectual conflict forever. Let's begin with a scene most of us recognize, a heated debate where facts have long been abandoned, voices are rising, and nobody is really listening anymore. Each person is simply waiting for their turn to speak, formulating their next point rather than truly hearing what's being said. From afar, it might look like passionate intellectual engagement, but Nietzsche would see something else entirely, a battlefield of insecure egos desperately seeking validation. Nietzsche observed that those who argue most fervently are often compensating for something they lack within, a sense of inner certainty, genuine self-assuredness, or authentic connection to their own values. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, he wrote. If you try it, you'll be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Consider this. Why do we feel such a powerful urge to correct others' misconceptions? Why does disagreement sometimes feel like a personal attack requiring immediate defense? Nietzsche would suggest that our desperate need to be right often reveals how fragile our sense of self actually is. The truly strong individual, in his view, doesn't need external validation of their perspective. They can hold space for different viewpoints without feeling threatened. This isn't to say that Nietzsche advocated for avoiding intellectual exchange altogether. Quite the opposite. He valued genuine dialogue and the clash of ideas as catalysts for growth. But he drew a sharp distinction between reactive arguing and genuine intellectual engagement. The former springs from insecurity and fear, the latter from curiosity and strength. Central to understanding Nietzsche's perspective is his concept of the Übermensch, or overman, his ideal of human potential. The Übermensch doesn't waste energy trying to prove themselves to others or seeking external validation. Instead, they focus on self-overcoming, on becoming more than they are. They're defined not by opposition to others, but by affirmation of their own values. Think about someone you deeply respect, perhaps a mentor, a friend, or a public figure. Do they engage in every possible argument? Do they jump to defend themselves against every criticism? Or do they move through the world with a quiet confidence, speaking thoughtfully when necessary, but never seeming desperate to convince others of their rightness? Nietzsche observed a psychological pattern he called raisonnement, a reactive state where people define themselves in opposition to others rather than to their own positive values. Those caught in raisonnement are constantly looking outward, comparing themselves to others, and feeling threatened by different perspectives. Their arguments become weapons to tear others down rather than tools to build understanding. In every real man, a child is hidden that wants to play, Nietzsche wrote. This playfulness, the ability to explore ideas without the heavy burden of needing to be right, is often missing from our argumentative culture. We've forgotten how to dance with ideas, to try them on without commitment, to value the journey of exploration over the destination of being correct. Let me share a personal example. Years ago, I found myself in constant intellectual battles, especially about politics and philosophy. I'd spend hours crafting arguments, researching counterpoints, and mentally rehearsing debates. I believed I was engaging in meaningful intellectual exercise, but in reality, I was exhausting myself and everyone around me. My identity had become so entangled with my viewpoints that any challenge felt like a personal attack. The turning point came when a friend gently asked, "What are you trying to prove, and to whom?" That question stopped me cold. I realized I wasn't pursuing truth or understanding. I was seeking validation. I wanted to be seen as intelligent, insightful, and right. My arguing wasn't about the ideas. It was about my ego's desperate need for affirmation. This recognition mirrors what Nietzsche identified as a fundamental human challenge, distinguishing between our authentic drives and our reactive, compensatory behaviors. He believed that true strength comes not from dominating others intellectually, but from mastering ourselves, our impulses, our insecurities, and our need for external validation. So what does this strength look like in practice? Imagine a conversation where someone challenges your deeply held belief. Your immediate instinct might be to defend, to counter-argue, to prove them wrong. The reactive approach is to engage immediately, to try to win the exchange. But the Nietzschean approach would be to pause, to create space between stimulus and response. In that space, you might ask yourself, why do I feel threatened by this perspective? What would happen if I simply listened without needing to respond immediately? What might I learn if I approach this with curiosity rather than defensiveness? This isn't about becoming passive or abandoning your convictions. Rather, it's about engaging from a place of genuine strength and security rather than fragile reactivity. The strong person can listen fully because they don't fear being changed by what they hear. They can consider alternative viewpoints because their sense of self doesn't depend on being right about everything. Nietzsche's insights become particularly relevant in today's digital landscape, where argumentation has been elevated to an art form, or perhaps reduced to a blood sport. Social media platforms reward quick, provocative responses over thoughtful reflection. Comment sections become battlegrounds where the goal is to destroy opposing viewpoints rather than understand them. We're constantly incentivized to react rather than reflect. Consider the last time you engaged in an online debate. Did you come away feeling enriched, having gained new insight or understanding? Or did you feel drained, perhaps momentarily satisfied at scoring points, but ultimately empty? Nietzsche would suggest that these hollow victories are symptoms of what he called the spirit of gravity, the heavy seriousness that crushes joy and creativity under the weight of ego-driven conflict. The alternative isn't disengagement but transformation, changing how we participate in intellectual exchange. Instead of approaching disagreements as battles to be won, we can see them as opportunities for growth and deeper understanding. This requires a fundamental shift in intention from proving ourselves right to exploring truth together. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is often misunderstood as domination over others, but he actually meant something more nuanced. The drive to overcome one's limitations and become more fully oneself. In the context of argumentation, the will to power manifests not as defeating others, but as mastering our own reactive tendencies and engaging from a place of genuine strength. Think about the difference between these two approaches. In the first, you enter a conversation armed with arguments, looking for weaknesses in the other person's position, ready to defend and attack as needed. In the second, you enter with curiosity, seeking to understand the other's perspective while remaining grounded in your own values, open to having your mind changed if compelling reasons arise. The first approach creates separation and often escalates tension. The second creates connection and opens possibilities for genuine understanding. Yet our culture often confuses the first approach with strength and the second with weakness. Nietzsche would suggest the opposite is true: the ability to listen without reactivity, to consider without capitulating, to engage without desperately needing to win. These are hallmarks of true strength. This brings us to another key Nietzschean insight, the distinction between what he called master morality and slave morality. These terms can be jarring to modern ears, but the psychological pattern he identified remains relevant. Master morality is characterized by affirmation creation, defining oneself by what one stands for rather than against. Slave morality, by contrast, is reactive and oppositional, defining oneself against others. When we argue from a place of insecurity, we're operating from what Nietzsche would call slave morality. Our position is defined by opposition rather than affirmation. We're saying, I'm right because you're wrong, rather than, this is what I believe, regardless of what you believe. The shift from reactive arguing to grounded dialogue represents a move from slave to master morality, from defining ourselves against others to affirming our own values. So how can we begin to make this shift in our own lives? Nietzsche's philosophy isn't just about critique. It offers a path toward transformation. Here are some practical steps inspired by his insights. First, practice the pause. When you feel the urge to argue or defend, create a moment of space before responding. This simple act interrupts the automatic reactivity that often drives unproductive arguments. In that space, You can choose how to engage rather than being driven by impulse. Second, examine your motives. Ask yourself, am I engaging to learn and understand, or am I trying to prove something about myself? What need is this argument serving? Often, you'll discover that beneath the intellectual content lies an emotional need for validation or recognition. Third, embrace what Nietzsche called a more fatty love of fate. This means accepting reality as it is, including the fact that others will hold views different from yours. Instead of wasting energy fighting against this reality, channel that energy into living according to your own values. As Nietzsche wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is a more fatty, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity." Fourth, cultivate perspective. Nietzsche believed in the value of viewing issues from multiple angles, of questioning even our most cherished beliefs. He wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This doesn't mean truth is entirely subjective, but rather that our understanding is always partial and situated within our particular perspective. Remembering this brings humility to our intellectual engagements. Fifth, focus on creation rather than reaction. Nietzsche valued creativity above criticism. Instead of spending your energy arguing against others' positions, channel it into developing and expressing your own original thoughts. Create rather than merely critique. Let's consider what these principles might look like in practice. Imagine you're at a dinner party and someone expresses a political view that contradicts your deeply held beliefs. The reactive approach would be to immediately counter with your own position, perhaps citing facts and figures to prove them wrong. The Nietzschean approach would be quite different. You might pause, take a breath, and get curious about how they arrived at their perspective. You might ask questions that help you understand their worldview rather than immediately trying to change it. You would remain connected to your own values without feeling threatened by their different position. And if you do share your perspective, it would be as an offering rather than a weapon, expressed not to defeat them, but to add another dimension to the conversation. The difference between these approaches isn't just philosophical. It's practical and experiential. The first typically leads to heightened tension, defensiveness, and a conversation where no one feels truly heard. The second creates space for genuine connection and mutual understanding, even amid disagreement. This brings us to perhaps the most powerful insight from Nietzsche's critique of argumentation. True dialogue becomes possible only when we're secure enough in ourselves that we don't need others to validate our perspectives. The desperate need to convince others often reveals a deeper need to convince ourselves. When we've done the inner work of clarifying our own values and making peace with uncertainty, we can engage with different viewpoints from a place of curiosity rather than fear. Nietzsche's famous statement that God is dead is often misunderstood as a simple declaration of atheism. In reality, he was pointing to something more profound, the collapse of absolute certainty in the modern world. Without fixed, external sources of meaning, we must create our own values and live with the uncertainty that entails. This uncertainty can be terrifying, driving us to seek the false comfort of absolutism and argue fiercely against anyone who threatens our fragile constructions. The alternative is to embrace what Nietzsche called joyful wisdom, the ability to dance lightly with ideas, to hold our beliefs firmly but not rigidly, to remain open to growth and change. This doesn't mean abandoning conviction. Nietzsche himself held strong positions, but it means holding those convictions with an open hand rather than a clenched fist, recognizing that our understanding is always evolving. In a world increasingly divided by ideological trenches, where argument often replaces dialogue and winning takes precedence over understanding, Nietzsche's insights offer a different path. They invite us to engage not from insecurity and reactivity, but from groundedness and genuine curiosity. They challenge us to examine our need to argue and to transform our intellectual exchanges from battles into dances. As we conclude this exploration, I invite you to reflect on your own relationship with argumentation. When do you feel most compelled to argue? What needs or fears might be driving that compulsion? How might your conversations change if you engage not to win, but to understand, not to prove yourself right, but to discover what's true? Nietzsche's philosophy ultimately points to a profound form of freedom, liberation from a need for external validation, and the courage to live according to one's own values. This freedom manifests not in argumentative dominance, but in the strength to remain silent when silence serves truth better than words, to listen when listening offers more than speaking, and to engage not from fear, but from genuine strength and curiosity. The next time you feel the pull to argue, remember Nietzsche's challenging wisdom. True strength isn't found in dominating conversations, but in mastering ourselves. It's not displayed in winning debates, but in living authentically. And perhaps most importantly, it's revealed not in how fiercely we defend our perspectives, but in how openly we can engage with different ones without losing ourselves in the process. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this perspective. Has there been a time when you recognize your own arguing as coming from insecurity rather than strength? How has your approach to disagreement evolved over time? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you found value in these ideas, please consider liking this video and subscribing to The Wisdom of Human Nature for more explorations of philosophy and psychology that can transform how we live and relate to one another. Remember, as Nietzsche himself might suggest, the goal isn't to win the argument, it's to win the struggle against our own reactive tendencies and to engage with life and others from a place of authentic strength. Thank you for joining me on this journey of exploration.